Welcome back. Hope you have gone through part 1 presentation on syllogisms. If not, please go through that before you move further because this presentation is designed as a continuation to part 1 and we keep referring to the concepts discussed there. If you are here after going through part 1, then let us move further. In that presentation, we set the foundation for learning the rule-based method of solving syllogisms. There we found that a categorical statement can be classified into one of the 4 types, namely universal affirmative, universal negative, particular affirmative, and particular negative based on the qualifiers. We also learned about how the distribution of subject and predicate vary depending on this classification. And finally, we glanced through the 8 rules without discussing them in detail. Now let us understand the rules clearly and learn to apply them on syllogism questions. Let us not lose focus of why we are doing all this. We are trying to solve syllogism questions that are quite common in aptitude tests. And we are trying to solve them faster than what is possible with a diagrammatic method. In an aptitude test, time is a premium commodity. And knowing how to apply these rules will help us save a lot of time. First and foremost, you should understand that these rules cannot be applied everywhere. These rules can be applied only in cases where we try to make a conclusion between non-middle terms or to check the validity of a conclusion given between non-middle terms. Rule 1. Every set of 2 premises should have 3 and only 3 terms of which one is common, called the middle term, between the 2 premises. These rules are applicable only in such cases. First rule states that 2 premises should have 3 and only 3 terms between them, and that one of those terms should be present in both the premises. That is, there should be a middle term. Otherwise, the rules cannot be applied. Rule 2. The middle term must be distributed at least in one of the premises. Otherwise, there cannot be a conclusion in the standard form between the non-middle terms. The second rule tells us to check the distribution pattern of the middle term in the premises. It should be distributed in at least one of the premises. Otherwise, there cannot be a conclusion in the standard form between the non-middle terms. This is an extremely important rule which we would use extensively while solving the questions. There is no problem if the middle term is distributed in both the premises. But if it is not distributed in any of the 2 premises, then as per this rule, we cannot have a valid conclusion in any of the 4 standard forms between the non-middle terms. If the first 2 rules are satisfied, then there is a possibility of a valid conclusion in the standard form between non-middle terms. The remaining rules tell us more about the nature of that possible conclusion. Rule 3 says that if one premise is negative, then the conclusion would also be negative. That is, if one of the premises has no, not, etc. in the qualifier, then the conclusion should also have those. Rule 4. If one premise is particular, then the conclusion should also be particular. That is, if the qualifier of one of the premises is some or many, then the conclusion will also have some or many. Rules 5 and 6. If both the premises are negative, then there cannot be a valid conclusion. If both the premises are particular, then there cannot be a valid conclusion. Rule 7 is an important rule. It states that no term can be distributed in the conclusion if it is not distributed in any of the premises. We have seen earlier that the terms in a premise will have different distribution patterns depending on the classification of the premise. The 7th rule states that only terms that are distributed in the premise are allowed to be distributed in the conclusion. We shall look at an illustration that will help you understand this rule clearly a little later. And finally, the eighth rule says that if both the premises are affirmative or positive, then the conclusion will also be affirmative or positive. That is, you cannot have a negative conclusion from positive premises. Do not worry if you are still not comfortable with the rules. In fact, they are quite simple, and once you learn to apply them, you will see that they are easier than thought. Now we shall look at some illustrations that will help you internalize these rules. Refer question 9. There we have two premises and we are asked to select the statement that follows from the given premises. Let us apply the rules to find out the right conclusion. We find that there are three terms between two premises, namely pets, cats, and horses. The term horses is the common term between the two premises. Thus, the first rule is satisfied. So, we can apply the remaining rules here. Now look at the options. All of them are between the non-middle terms pets and cats. That means that the validity of all the options can be checked using the rules. What we do next is to mark the distribution pattern of the terms in the premises. The first premise is a universal affirmative premise. So the subject pets is distributed and the predicate horses is not. The second premise is a particular affirmative premise. Though the subject horses and the predicate cats, both of them are not distributed. Observe the distribution pattern of the middle term horses. The middle term horses is not distributed in any of the two premises. Rule number 2 says that the middle term must be distributed at least in one of the premises. Thus, rule number 2 is not satisfied here. So, there cannot be a conclusion in the standard form between non-middle terms pets and cats. And so, the right answer is option D, none of these. See how easy it becomes to find the answer once you learn the rules. We shall have 3 more illustrations and you will be clear on how to apply the rules. Look at question Q10. There are 3 terms, namely mothers, sisters, and doctors. The two premises have a common term, sisters. So conditions given in rule 1 are satisfied and we can apply the remaining rules to find the conclusion between the non-middle terms. When we look at the options, we can see that all of them are between non-middle terms mothers and doctors. So the rules are applicable for all of them. The next step is to check the distribution pattern of the middle term. The first premise is a particular affirmative premise and so both subject and predicate are not distributed. In the second premise, which is a universal affirmative premise, subject is distributed and predicate is not. We can see that the middle term sisters is distributed in the second premise. Thus rule 2 is satisfied and so there is a possibility for the standard relation occurring between non-middle terms mothers and doctors. Once we see that rule 2 is satisfied, we can look at the other rules that tell us more about the possible relation. On a closer look at the premises, we can observe that the first premise is particular in nature. So as per one of our rules, the conclusion should also be particular. Both the premises are affirmative or positive. In such a case, as per rule 8, the conclusion should also be affirmative. So the conclusion should be both particular and affirmative. Thus we are looking for a particular affirmative conclusion between mothers and doctors. Option A, which is a universal negative statement, is ruled out. On the same lines, option B, which is a particular negative statement, is ruled out as it is negative in nature. Since option B is ruled out, option D is also ruled out. So the answer should be option C, which is both particular and affirmative. Before we decide that option C is the conclusion, let us look at the distribution pattern of option C and see if rule number 7 is satisfied there or not. Option C is a particular affirmative statement, and the distribution pattern is both subject and predicate not distributed. Let us go back to rule number 7, which we saw earlier. Rule number 7 states that no term can be distributed in the conclusion if it is not distributed in any of the premises. In the case of option C, both the terms mothers and doctors are not distributed. So rule number 7 does not come into picture here. Rule number 7 will have to be checked only when we have a distributed term in the conclusion. In that case, we need to check whether that term is distributed in the premise as well or not. Thus, we can see that option C satisfies all the rules. Hence, the answer is option C. Many mothers are doctors. Let us once again analyze the process we went through just now. First, we should check Rule 1, which tells us whether the conditions for applying the rules are satisfied or not. Then, we check the distribution pattern of the middle term, that is rule number 2. If rule number 2 is satisfied, then the remaining rules help us eliminate different options and move closer to the final answer. Finally, we check the distribution pattern of the probable answer to see if rule 7 is also satisfied or not. With practice, you will be able to do all these really fast. When you apply the rules, you should always remember that for a conclusion to be valid, all rules should be satisfied. If any rule is violated, then that relation cannot be the conclusion. Let us look at the next illustration. Refer Q11. Here we have another standard syllogism problem. There are 3 terms between 2 premises. Middle term is yellow. So rule 1 is satisfied. The middle term yellow is distributed in the second premise. Hence rule number 2, which states that the middle term should be distributed in at least one of the premises, is also satisfied. So there is a possibility of a standard relation between non-middle terms red and white. Let us see what that relation could be. One premise is particular, so the conclusion should also be particular. One premise is negative, so the conclusion should also be negative. That means that the conclusion between non-middle terms red and white should be both particular and negative. That is, we are looking for a relation of the type some are not between red and white. There is no such conclusion among the options given. So the answer is option E. You may think, wait, that these rules are to be applied only when we try to make a conclusion between non-middle terms or to validate a given conclusion between non-middle terms. Check the options once again. Option A, B and C are between non-middle terms. What about option D? There the relation given is between white and yellow. We have seen that yellow is the middle term between the 2 premises. The middle term yellow is part of option D. We cannot use the rules to check the validity of such a conclusion. What we have to do there is to analyze the premise that contains these 2 terms, white and yellow, and see whether this conclusion can be deduced from that statement or not. Let us look at that premise relating white and yellow. The second premise. It says, no yellow is white. Conclusion D is, no white is yellow. That is true, isn't it? If no yellow is white, then it means that there are no common elements between yellow and white, and so the option D, no white is yellow, is also true and hence the answer. You should watch out for such tricky situations in the tests. Let us look at one more problem before we conclude this discussion. Refer Q12. This is a very important example as we are going to have a clear understanding on how to use Rule 7 through this illustration. The two premises given here are, all fools are famous, all engineers are fools. As you can see, there are three terms between the two premises, and the common term or the middle term is fools. You should understand that the middle term is the term that is common to both the premises. It may or may not come in the middle. All the four options given are between the non-middle terms. So we can use the rules to check whether those conclusions are valid or not. Let us first check the distribution pattern of the middle term fools. It is distributed in the first premise. Hence rule number 2, which states that the middle term should be distributed in at least one of the premises, is satisfied. So there is possibility of a standard relation between non-middle terms. Now let us see what that relation could be. None of the premises are particular or negative. So the rules pertaining to negative or particular premises will not come into play here. Both the premises are affirmative. Hence, as per Rule 8, the conclusion should also be affirmative. That means option C, which is a negative statement, cannot be the answer. Now, option A and option B are universal affirmative statements, and option D is a combination of options A and B. To decide among these three, we will have to look at Rule 7. This rule is with regard to the distribution patterns of the terms in the premises and the conclusion. Let us look at the distribution pattern of the terms in options A and B. Option A, all famous are engineers, is a universal affirmative statement. It is consistent with our requirement that the conclusion be an affirmative statement. Look at the distribution pattern given in the slide. Here, we find that the term famous is distributed in option A, which we are considering as a possible conclusion. However, the term famous is not distributed in the premise. This is not allowed as per rule number 7. The rule states that for a term to be distributed in the conclusion, it should be distributed in the premise. That is, only terms that are distributed in the premise can be distributed in the conclusion. So option A violates rule number 7 and hence not the answer. Now let us look at option B. It is a universal affirmative statement. It is consistent with our requirement that the conclusion be an affirmative statement. The distribution pattern here is subject engineers distributed, predicate famous not distributed. Thus we find that the term engineers is distributed in option B, which we are considering as a possible conclusion. Look at the premises for the distribution of the term engineers. It is distributed in the second premise. Rule number 7, which says no term can be distributed in the conclusion if it is not distributed in any of the premises, is satisfied in the case of option B. All other rules are also satisfied. So option B is the answer. It is important that you understand rule number 7 very clearly. It states that for a term to be distributed in the conclusion, it should be distributed in any of the premises. The implication of rule number 7 on different scenarios are given in the table. It can be explained as follows. A term can be distributed in the premise and not distributed in the conclusion. A term can be distributed in the premise and distributed in the conclusion. A term can be not distributed in the premise and not distributed in the conclusion. A term cannot be not distributed in the premise and distributed in the conclusion. As we come to the close of this session, it would be good if we quickly recollect the important things that we learned here. In a nutshell, we learned the rule-based method of solving syllogisms. In the process, we learned about categorical syllogisms and their classification into 4 types, the distribution pattern of the subject and predicate, and the 8 rules for solving syllogism questions. We saw 4 illustrative examples where we applied these principles to solve syllogism questions. You should practice with more questions so that you become adept in using these rules. The illustrations that were shown in the presentation pertain to one common pattern of syllogism questions. There are some more variations that are asked in aptitude tests, all of which can be tackled using the rules we learned. Thank you.